on this. Joining us from Singapore is James Dorsey. He's an adjunct senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Thanks so much for joining us on TRT World. I wonder this reaction from Hezbollah, as we've been hearing from our reporter, that many had been hoping for more, many have described it as muted. Do you think that's a strategic choice from the group, or actually a reflection of how effective this series of attacks this week from Israel has been?
I think your correspondent in Beirut, Priyanka, very well portrayed the tightrope that Hezbollah is walking. There is a part of the Lebanese population that really wants nothing to do with this war, doesn't feel that this is its war, and that Hezbollah should never have provoked it. Keep in mind that Hezbollah linked the Israeli attack on Gaza to combat operations that it initiated on the Lebanese-Israeli border. And of course, on the other hand, again, as your correspondent correctly pointed out, Hezbollah is not capable at this moment of properly catering to the aspirations and expectations of part of its support base. That puts it in a very difficult position, because what it needs to demonstrate is that it still maintains sufficient command and control to be able to defend Lebanese territory, defend itself, and strike against Israel, but doing that in a form of fashion that does not escalate into a full-fledged Middle East, a full-fledged war in Lebanon, that would significantly harm an already suffering country.
What's next then, do you think? If you, as you're saying, you think Hezbollah are keen not to escalate into a fully fledged conflict, what do you expect to happen next? Do you predict Israel going about some kind of heavy bombing followed by a ground invasion with perhaps those troops that we've seen being gathered on the border, something like we saw in Gaza, or not at all?
Well, I think it could come to that. What I think that the Israeli objective at this point is going to be is to exploit the blows that it has dealt Hezbollah, both in terms with both with the exploding communication devices as well as the killing of Ibrahim Akil, a prominent military commander. That it will hope to exploit that with further military action to convince Hezbollah to withdraw for all practical purposes towards the Litani River, which means withdrawing some 30 kilometers north of the Israeli-Lebanese border, which would then enable Israel to declare the border zone safe again and allow its evacuated population to return.
And you mentioned the return of those citizens to the north of Israel. It's interesting that that has now been added to the Israeli government's war goals, and a slight reframing, I think, of the northern conflict for them. Meanwhile, the US has kind of agreed that, yeah, that is a good war goal, and hasn't really done very much in the last week, if we're honest. What do you see the US position and the US impact being from now to, January, really?
Well, I think we've seen that already with what happened this week in Lebanon. With other words, President Biden's special envoy, Adam Hochstein, had barely left Israel when the communication devices exploded. As Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, was very clear in his meetings with Hochstein that Israel was going to do what it felt it needed to do, irrespective of what American advice was. American advice was not to escalate. American advice was to negotiate, not something that Israel at this point is willing to do. I don't think that the United States is going to fundamentally change its position, particularly not in the run-up to an election, which is less than 2 months away.
All right, interesting stuff. James Dorsey, thank you so much for joining us on TRT World.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure.